This week we're covering two topics, formulating ideas and ethical writing. Both of them are kind of foundational to the course. We're also going to start thinking about possible final project ideas. So if you haven't already, it's going to be important to start brainstorming what you might be interested in covering for your final project. And we're going to start formally exploring them this week. Okay, so one of the biggest issues to get you started on the right track for this class is determining what you will write our final paper about. And so one of the first parts is to identify the purpose and parameters. So when you have an assignment, be it for this class or another class, you want to go and look at the grading requirements, look at what's posted in your syllabus, look at what's on Canvas, any grading rubrics that you can find to help figure out exactly what you need to write, what are the limitations on the topic, what's the purpose of the paper, and things like that. So you're going to use those to formulate your question. You're going to kind of start with a broad question, something like what's the best study strategy to learn new material? And then you want to narrow down to specific for the paper. So if you have to do some kind of compare and contrast, is it better to study in a single long session or more shorter sessions might be your topic. Next, you're going to identify some sources. So textbooks and popular sources might be okay for kind of the pre-research beginning part to get your ideas. For this class, at least, you'll need to be using scholarly sources for your actual paper. But for other classes, again, those rules might change. So this is why it's important to understand those parameters so you can correctly identify your sources. So if you don't know what you want to write, a couple of things that you might do to help you figure it out. First is review textbooks and class notes, not from this class, but from other classes that you've taken. So if you still have your Introduction to Psychology book, you need to pick a topic in psychology. So this might be a really good place to start figuring out exactly what area you might want to look at. Other classes that have interested you that you really liked, review your notes or your textbooks for those and think about what aspect of that did you really like? What do you want to learn more about? You can also Google ideas. Now, Google and online sources are okay for a starting point. Generally, websites won't be acceptable sources for your final paper, but they might be helpful in getting you started. So sometimes you might have a very vague topic idea and you can't figure out how to narrow it down, and Google or Wikipedia can be a really good starting point for you trying to figure out what exactly you want to say. So let's say you want to study memory, but that's way too broad of a topic, right? So maybe you start by looking at the Wikipedia article on memory, and you see they talk about different types of memory, and autobiographical memory kind of catches your eye, and then you start thinking about how autobiographical memory might affect eyewitness testimony. Now you're getting to kind of the level of specificity in a topic that could work really well for this paper. You're not going to be citing the Wikipedia article because you're just using that to kind of narrow your ideas. Now that you've decided you want to write a paper on eyewitness memory or eyewitness testimony in memory, you're going to go and actually look at the psychological research on that topic. Okay, so there's a lot of different types and levels of research that happens when you're in the writing process, and it's not necessarily linear. So it's important to remember that you may need to kind of take a step back if your topic isn't working or you're not finding research that's working for you. So pre-research, this is where you might use Wikipedia or other online sources as you try to figure out exactly what angle you want to take and what there might be research on. So to help you pick a paper topic, you might do some research or get general information and potential topics. So you might do some brainstorming, some free writes, you might look at popular or scholarly sources, and start kind of narrowing your field down to specific topics. Once you kind of have a topic you think is going to work, so hopefully at the end of this week, you'll do preliminary research. So the goal here is to gather information about your topic, figure out what your research question or thesis is going to be, and narrow your focus. And so this is starting to look at scholarly sources Get familiar with the research. You might read some more closely that seem like they're really good. Some of them you might just skim, but you're trying to confirm that yes, you have enough information for your topic. And then eventually you get to that focused research where you're really looking for in-depth knowledge, figuring out what supports your argument. And so you're reading articles very closely. Note that, first of all, this is not linear. So you might change your thesis. So you're constantly needing to kind of readjust. So we'll talk about your thesis statement in a minute, but your paper will need to make an argument. And if you start doing research and realize that all the evidence contradicts your argument, then you might need to either reevaluate your thesis or reevaluate the research that you found. So kind of keeping these steps in mind and going back and forth is really important. So often we start with really big ideas, right? Broad subjects. But once you get that big idea, you have the subject, you need to expand on it. So most typically we get students who say, I want to write a paper on memory, which is way too broad. The key to succeeding in this class and having a paper that's manageable to write is, and this is true in general as well, is finding a paper that has the appropriate level of specificity. So we'll have individual meetings that help with this too. But normally we start with a big idea. Maybe I have a student who says, I want to write a paper about cognitive development. That's way too broad. As you start to narrow it down to a thesis, you want to think about how you'll expand. Okay, maybe I specifically want to look at the influences of early childhood education on cognitive development. Okay, we're getting a little more specific. And the final question is, how can you make it into an argument? So this is another thing. We'll have several exercises in class to help support this. But often students struggle with going from kind of a topic into making an argument. So we are reviewing literature in your final paper, but the goal of this paper is to use the evidence, the literature that you've read, to make some kind of argument. And that argument is your thesis. Okay, so you want to use that literature to prove a point. If you are writing a research paper, the literature review would look very similar and it would lead up to your hypothesis. So even then, you're working up to making an argument. So the thesis is crucial, and where I see many people go wrong, you need that argumentative edge to make an interesting paper and to make clear what the purpose is. So keep in mind that your thesis might change depending on the evidence you find. Your thesis is not what your paper is about. So this paper is about sleep deprivation and torture. It's not something that's going to draw the reader in. Instead, you need to make an argument. So if I'm writing a paper on the topic of sleep deprivation and torture, my thesis might be something like, even without physical assault, sleep deprivation constitute torture when used as an enhanced interrogation technique. So making your subject or your topic into a thesis sometimes requires work, and it often requires you to narrow down exactly what you think you're going to talk about, and then you'll use the evidence to back it up. But this is part of the process and really important to having this paper be manageable. Okay, so here's an opportunity to try it yourself. I've listed several topics, and what I want you to do is pause the video and write a thesis statement about each one of these topics. Remember that your thesis should be a clear argument that indicates some direction, and it should be a statement, not a question. Okay, here's another slide. And again, you can review those. If you have questions, you're free to email me. For this one, the first one are kind of poor thesis statements. So for the first one, it's a question, right? We know a thesis statement needs to be a statement. So I want you to try to rewrite that as a statement rather than a question. And the second one is a statement. The campus would look different with more beautification projects, but it doesn't tell me about the direction, right? How would the campus look different? Of course it would look different. Would it look better or worse? So you need to make sure that your thesis statement is making a clear argument about the direction of the effect. So again, please pause the video and make an attempt to rewrite these as a strong thesis statement. Okay, and these are some examples of potential responses. Again, number 1 is just rephrased as a statement instead of a question. Number 2, beautification projects would improve the appearance of our campus. So instead of just saying it would make the campus look different, now we've got a direction. Okay, so ethical writing is the other topic for this. What do I mean when I say ethical writing? This is kind of tricky because we normally don't think about writing as kind of an ethical field, but there's a number of ethical issues in writing. The biggest has to do with how we give credit to other people when we're using their ideas. So you are at the point in your paper where you're just starting to think of your own ideas, but very soon you'll be reading other people's ideas and thinking about how to integrate them and use them to support your own. Okay, so here I'd like you to take a second and just pause the video and jot down your responses. I've got 3 questions to see how much you know about plagiarism. Okay. So, a couple of resources here. I'm not going to review this. I know it's small on the slide, but this is posted on Canvas as the plagiarism infographic. It comes from Turnitin, which is the plagiarism checker that A&M Central Texas uses. So this is a resource that includes millions of students' data, and it gives you some great tips on how students go wrong and how serious the various instances and types of plagiarism are. So review this, make sure you're clear on exactly what plagiarism means, and if you're struggling, you might use this as you're writing your papers. So plagiarism is defined as using others' ideas and words without clearly acknowledging the source of information. So in college, a large portion of what we do is engage with others' ideas, texts, lectures, discussions, and we incorporate them into our own writing. So it's important that we are able to do this, but also give people credit where it's due. So when we talk about ethical writing, we're talking about how we give other people credit for their ideas. So plagiarism happens when we use other people's ideas and words without clearly acknowledging the source of information. So everything we cover in this class should generalize to your other classes, but plagiarism and ethical writing in particular is really important. We have universally accepted standards in the department, in the university, and it is written into the university honor code that plagiarism is explicitly not allowed. So some general kind of terms to know as we're starting. One is general knowledge. So kind of the exception to needing to cite your source is when the information is general knowledge. So this is generally known information. You don't need to document it. John F. Kennedy was elected president of the US in 1960. We need to document facts that are not generally known or ideas that interpret these facts. When we talk about a direct quotation, we're talking about placing a passage in quotation marks and using someone else's words exactly. So we indicate that we've done this by putting the passage in quotation marks. In APA style, we also cite the authors and the year and page number. We have a way to do this in APA format. However, it is extremely rarely used in psychology. Okay, so generally you really shouldn't be using direct quotes in your papers for this or any other psychology classes, because in APA style, and you'll notice as you're reading psychology papers, they almost never use direct quotes. What we use instead is paraphrasing. Here we have, with paraphrasing, we are using somebody else's ideas, but putting them into your own words. So this is a skill that you really will use the most and need to work on when incorporating sources into your writing. So it's not just that we are putting someone's ideas in their own words, or in our own words. Well, that is a skill of paraphrasing. But in order to make sure that that paraphrasing is not plagiarism, you still have to acknowledge the source. So in psychology, most of the time when we're talking about someone else's work, we describe their work in our own ideas, but we still cite them to give them credit. Okay, so I know some of these are long, but I really encourage you to pause and review them carefully, take the time to understand, because understanding this will help you immensely in this class and others. Okay, so read the original passage and then read the passage by the student writer and decide, is it plagiarism, why or why not? Okay, so I would call this instance plagiarism. The writer has only changed around a few words or phrases, or changed the order of the original sentences. They haven't really put it in their own words or made dramatic changes. But the bigger issue is that the writer in their passage has not acknowledged or cited the source of any of the ideas or facts. So if someone were reading this writer's work, they would assume that these ideas came from the writer themselves instead of the original source. Okay, here's another one. Same original source. Read what writer 2 has written. Okay, so in this one, the writer has accurately relayed the information from the original source, but uses their own words. And the writer also has done that crucial thing, which is citing her sources, right? She's got this parenthetical citation at the end, which lets us know the source of the information. Okay, a third one for you to check. Okay, so for this one, I would again say that this is not plagiarism. It records the information from the original passage accurately. It gives credits to the ideas in the passage, right? We've got that parenthetical citation, which is important. And it's also indicated with parentheses, quotation marks, which part is taken directly from the source by putting the passage in quotation marks and citing the page number. So note that when you just are paraphrasing, all you need to cite is the author's last name and year. But when you are using a direct quote, you also need to indicate the page number. Okay, so a couple of guidelines for ethical writing. The first is, here's a list of times that you need to give credit. And in general, you want to give credit whenever you use another person's ideas, opinion, or theory. Okay, so anytime you're taking another person's ideas or presenting their theory or opinions, you want to make sure to give them credit. You also want to give credit whenever you use facts, statistics, graphs, or drawings, anything that's not common knowledge. When you use direct quotations from another person's spoken or written words. And also when you paraphrase another person's spoken or written words, you still need to cite them. When you're in doubt, it's better to include a citation than to leave it out, and it's easier to remove unnecessary ones than go back and try to figure out where you got that information. So, a couple of things to avoid plagiarism. Even if you're paraphrasing, you still need to know the source of where your notes came from. And if you're taking notes today and you are writing your paper 2 months from now, you're not going to remember where they came from. So one key strategy is to connect your notes to a specific source. Anytime you're taking notes, you need to make sure that you have very clearly labeled the source that they came from. When we talk about note taking and how to read research articles, we'll talk about some strategies for that. When you take notes digitally, you can use an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document to organize this information. If you're using something like note cards, you want to make sure each source is identified on the note card. When you are taking notes, you want to put anything that comes directly from the text in quotations in your notes. So it is clear from your notes that you have taken a direct quote. The best strategy, though, is to paraphrase right from the beginning. So paraphrase while you're taking notes. Make sure you're not just rearranging words, but read the entire paragraph or what you want to paraphrase. Read it carefully, cover the text, and then write out the idea in your own words without peeking. That is the best way to, first of all, guarantee that you understand it, and second of all, guarantee that you're not actually plagiarizing. What can happen is if you take notes and are taking notes word for word from the source, then when you go back and you look at your source or your notes in 2 months to write, you might say, oh, I must have paraphrased, I'm just going to copy from my notes, and now you've kind of accidentally plagiarized. So very important, paraphrase while you're taking notes, and then even better when you're writing your paper, paraphrase again. Okay, so the best way to avoid plagiarism, again, is to read the passage several times, cover it, and write it in your own words without looking. Okay, so let's try this together. So first, pause the video to read this over a couple of times. Don't write anything down, but pause the video as long as you need to read this over a few times and make sure you understand it. Okay, now on the blank screen, I want you to attempt to paraphrase what you just read. So without looking at the text, write down what you just said, even if you can't remember, and also attempt to cite the source. Okay, and here's a second example. Pause the slide to read the text. And then when you're done reading it, without looking at the actual text, attempt to paraphrase and write it in your own words and cite the source. Okay, so you've got a few more plagiarism tutorials and resources on Canvas, so please be sure to check them out because this material is very important.